What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Factory Tour. I'm your host, Paul Patterson. I'm joined today by a special guest, former contributor at Dynasty Football Factory, now a lead Dynasty analyst over at the 33rd team. It's Ian Miller. You can follow him on Twitter at DynastyIM. Ian, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing fantastic. Excited to get into this.
Yeah, man, should be a fun time. We're kind of in the middle of the season here, between week 9 and week 10, and I feel like I don't know. It's kind of a lag in the season a little bit. Like there's not much going on with waivers. The teams in your leagues have kind of decided where they stand for the most part. You've got your contenders, you've got your tanking teams. I mean, there's still trades going on, but the trade deadline's usually not for a few weeks in the leagues that have those. And so I don't know, not a lot of action for me recently. So we got to dig in, look for, the relevant narratives, what's actionable. And so I think we found a few things here. We're going to talk a little bit about the Daniel Jones injury and how that might affect the 101 conversation. Just a little speculation here at the top. Talk about some players. I'm interested in how your process specifically sees these players that we'll talk about and whether, you're buying or selling some of these guys. And then a little rookie quarterback talk. CJ Stroud just lit the world on fire. So it should be good. But right off the top here, Daniel Jones seems to have suffered a season-ending injury. So I guess it's Tommy DeVito for the Giants the rest of the year. That sounds absolutely unwatchable, but it feels bad for Daniel Jones. Obviously, he's been under fire all season, couldn't get any blocking from that offensive line. Finally, he's just couldn't hold on any longer. Before we talk about 101 or Caleb Williams or anything, I guess we can just start with Daniel Jones. What do you think about Jones as is this somebody you could buy on the cheap? You think he's potentially still starting for them next year, or is this just like a stay away situation for you?
Yeah, I'm not too interested in Daniel Jones and Dynasty. I mean, this year he was an absolute train wreck of a passing quarterback, sub 60 PFF passing grade. It was not pretty and much regression from last year, where even when we looked at last year and called it a career year for Daniel Jones, there were eye-popping peripherals by any stretch of the imagination. The eye-popping part was that this was someone who has been a solid rusher, and then last year gets up to 7.1 rushing points per game. And that's what was to like about Daniel Jones, was you had this quarterback who now has a contract extension. And even if he's not a good passer, he can still provide a pretty stable floor with if he's going to put up 7+ rushing points per game. When you go down with an ACL injury and you come back, like we saw with Burrow and we'll probably see with Kyler's, there's a bit of regression that happens when it comes to rushing points per game, rushing production. And so when we have a quarterback who hasn't shown that he is a good passer, and for the most part of this year was an absolute terrible passer, and now we don't have a solid rushing floor, even when he does return. So Daniel Jones isn't someone that I'm just looking to buy on the low, really.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. I was kind of out on Jones at his price this offseason. I definitely didn't expect the offense to fall apart to the extent that it did, but I didn't see quite the ceiling that other people had seen. And it was some of the same stuff, just like the passing wasn't really there, and the rushing seemed more likely to regress than anything. And we did see that definitely. I think I'm with you. Probably not trying to buy into him. We'll see where his price lands. Like I think he's a starter in the NFL. Like I don't think he's a quality starter, but I just look around the league at guys that are starting games. I think there's a pretty good chance that Daniel Jones is starting games for the Giants or for somebody for a few years to come, even with this injury. So, somebody's like, give me a third round pick for Daniel Jones. I might do that and just kind of stash him and see what happens, but not a priority target for me. I'd rather buy like Kirk Cousins or something. If I'm tanking, I'm trying to put some pieces on my injured reserve for next year. That's probably more interesting to me. But what is interesting now is the Giants sit with 2 wins, and with Tommy DeVito at the helm, I mean, we can't really pencil them in comfortably for more wins. I mean, the NFL is crazy any given Sunday and whatever, but it doesn't really look like it. I mean, they basically just handed off to Saquon Barkley on just about every play when he's been under center. They're probably not going to be winning a lot of games, and that puts them, in the conversation, only 1 game out of the 101. So you look at the draft order right now. Arizona's sitting there with the first pick currently, but they have Kyler expected to return this week. And then you have Carolina also with 1 win. And I mean, Bryce Young has looked pretty rough. Chicago owns that pick. They also own the 103, which is their own pick. Then you have the Giants and you have the Patriots. Those are all your 2 and under win teams. Of those options, is there one that sticks out to you where you would love to see them with the 101? You'd love to see them draft Caleb Williams?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's going to be some situations that are better than others. I mean, you and me are probably the same in that we look at draft capital more importantly than anything else. But obviously, with Caleb Williams, we have a very strong idea that he's going number 1 overall. So it's just which situation is best for him. And I think one of the situations where he ends up with the Bears is probably not a friendly one, considering that we've seen a pretty incompetent offense at times and incompetent decision making. Like, yes, we could go back to Chase Claypool last year where they basically spent an end of first round pick to go get Chase Claypool. And basically everyone knew that Chase Claypool was not really that guy, especially someone that you're going to spend the 32nd pick in the draft on. So there's some very puzzling decisions out of Chicago. But I think, honestly, the Giants has to be the favorite if he was to go to someone. We've seen what Daboll can do. And when we talk about Daniel Jones' career passing season, which wasn't great, but for his standards, it elevated him. And that came from Brian Daboll's first season in New York. So I think for looking at situations, it'd be pretty awesome to see Caleb Williams in a Giants uniform.
So as an Eagles fan, I'm very conflicted about this. Like I certainly have no interest in Caleb Williams entering my division. But I agree with you that it would be a good spot. I mean, you have to like the fit with Daboll there. Think about Caleb Williams, like his mobility, his escapability, and you think about what Daboll did with Josh Allen in Buffalo, and then obviously what he did with Daniel Jones as well, who's also got some mobility. I would like that a lot more than Chicago. Chicago I don't think Justin Fields is a world beater, but I also don't think that they've really built up the offense around him or tried to run it in a way that fits his strengths. And I just wouldn't have a ton of faith in them doing that for Caleb either. So that's tough. I think that they're probably the most likely team to land him. Just they own 2 of the top 3 picks right now. I think Arizona is going to win some games with Kyler back under center. Not a ton, but if they win 2 more games, they probably aren't going to be the first pick. So you have to really hope that the Panthers can maybe steal one from the Falcons or the Buccaneers or something and push their way out of that conversation. Because I would love to see him in the Giants. Honestly, I think the best spot that's probably not really in the conversation right now, but just like on the fringes, the Rams currently hold the 6th pick, but they do have 3 wins already. So they're probably not in the conversation, but man, I would love to see him there with Sean McVay. Let him just kind of push the reset button, let Stafford retire or let him move on. But McVay with Caleb Williams would be pretty incredible as well. Excuse me. So we have Caleb Williams penciled in kind of as that first pick, but Marvin Harrison Jr. has also had a lot of hype as an early draft pick as well. Could go as high as the 2nd pick in the draft. He probably won't, but easily a top 5 pick right now. It would seem, as the consensus. So, is there also a spot that you look at these teams where you think he would fit in nicely? For me, it's Arizona. Like, get him to Arizona with Kyler Murray. I believe in Kyler Murray as a quality quarterback. It would certainly help out all my Kyler Murray shares that I have. He's like my most rostered quarterback. But just for Marvin Harrison, like looking at the teams at the top of the draft, I mean, when you're at the top of the draft, you usually have quarterback questions. Arizona is kind of a unique case where they do have a quarterback. He's just been out with injury. And so I think that would make sense as a good fit. But what about you?
I do actually think that would be pretty funny if we saw Marvin Harrison go to the Cardinals after we just spent an offseason of Kyler Murray so bad, and they might replace him with Caleb Williams because they're so bad, just for Kyler Murray to return, get them out of the number 1 spot, and then he gets a new awesome receiver. I think that would be pretty funny. And it would also be funny, if we saw Marvin Harrison go to the Falcons, and then we finally get to see Kadero Hodge get unlocked. So that would be something to see. But talking realistic, I 100% agree with you on Arizona. That would be a great spot where they have a quarterback, because when you look at some of these teams, Chicago obviously has been a team that not only hasn't had strong quarterback success, but even when Fields has had good weeks, good stretches, they're coming on high passing volume, which is what you typically like to see when you have a receiver on a team. And then the Giants, uncertain quarterback. And even, in Daniel Jones' career season, it was like 30.1 pass attempts per game. That's on the lower end. The Patriots have lived on the lower end. So these teams that we're seeing near the top and, possible Marvin Harrison teams, it's not super friendly for fantasy success, at least at the wide receiver position. So that's a bit of a disappointment, but it's still very early. The talent is going to still put him at 102, 103, possibly even 101 in some drafts. But yeah, I don't think there's an awesome rock star situation we can point to and say it would be great if he landed right here. Like we don't have a Jamar Chase going to a Joe Burrow Bengals or anything like that.
Yeah, because even Kyler Murray, like I think that would be the best spot of all the realistic spots. But even he, as a mobile quarterback, he's probably not going to be lighting up the pass attempts like a Joe Burrow, like a Justin Herbert. So we don't really have that spot right now. We'll see. It's a long season, and who knows? Maybe he ends up tethered to like another rookie quarterback or something, and things change fast. It's not going to really affect where we're drafting him. It's just kind of fun to speculate on where he could land. I love the Atlanta comment though. Like just thinking about next year, like week 9, Arthur Smith's like, yeah, Marvin Harrison's doing some great work away from the ball. I mean, imagine, if you can get Marvin Harrison, Drake London, Bijan Robinson, and Kyle Pitts on the field at the same time. Can you imagine how open Matt Collins is going to be? Like just unbelievable work there. It's gonna be fantastic. Now that dude needs to get fired. Like I know that you're a big Drake London guy. Just based on like how your process works, I'm sure your model loves Drake London. So you've got to be tilting right alongside me with this usage, right?
Yeah, I think Bijan is the most puzzling too, because when you talk about Bijan, like part of the reason that Kyle Pitts and Drake London weren't that viable last year was because they threw the 3rd lowest pass attempts since the 2000s started. So 23 years of sample size, and they're the 3rd lowest pass attempt season. That's obviously going to hold anyone back. And now this season, they're at least more adequate in that. But the target shares and peripherals for both of them have weirdly gone down. Kyle Pitts is posting essentially a lower target rate than he did as a rookie and a sophomore. Drake London is posting lower peripherals than he did as a rookie. But the most puzzling one is they get a Bijan, who we know, they will run the ball. They're one of the highest teams last year in rush attempts per game. And then they still run the ball, except now we have a sub 40% carry percentage for Bijan Robinson, and Tyler Gio has a 4.9% higher carry percentage. So some things just aren't making sense. You can point to numbers and talk about probabilities, but this seems like one of those things where it's not even playing probabilities. You're just, putting it in a losing situation, honestly.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. Like I really didn't think there was any way that Bijan was going to fail. And I mean, I'm not going to say that he's failed at all, but he hasn't. He was a 1st round redraft pick. So obviously from that standpoint, it's failed. And yeah, I mean, I thought they were going to try to run the heck out of the ball. And I thought Bijan's talent was just too much for any coach to deny, but apparently not Arthur Smith. He is a force to be reckoned with, regardless of how much more efficient, Bijan Robinson is. It doesn't matter. They trust Algier, at the goal line, and he's reliable. I think it's still coming for Bijan. I mean, in Dynasty for sure, like if there is a buy window opening, and I think it is like slowly but surely. I saw a poll that is Bijan Robinson the Dynasty RB1, and it was like pretty close to 50-50, like yes or no. For me, he's still like by far my Dynasty RB1. So I would still be looking into buying him. Like he's demonstrated an ability to earn targets at a really impressive rate, early in the year. He still is super efficient. It's really just a question of when is Arthur Smith going to get out of the way. And I don't know, maybe it's just foolish optimism, but I think sooner or later, like he's going to get unleashed. Jonathan Taylor, struggled to start his rookie season as well. It wasn't the exact same situation, but we saw a big breakout towards the end of the year. I think that's still very much in play for Bijan. So
I think the weirdest thing too is that we actually saw the breakout right away. Like in the first month of the season, he was running back 4, and actually his carry percentage, we were like, shoot, when this goes up, we could really start seeing a ceiling, especially when you're talking about someone that even when he's not being used, like we're talking about, still has a 14% target share. Like it's almost like we saw the breakout, and now for some reason we're just putting it on hold. It's not one of those things where they had to get eased in. Like he was terrific right away.
Yeah. Yeah, he was. He didn't have any like shortcomings and any limitations. I don't even think I think he did have like a fumble last week or the week before or something, but it's not like he had ball security issues like early in the year where they were trying to ease him in. So I don't know. I don't know if there is any rhyme or reason to Arthur Smith's decision making. If there is, it's probably just how do I screw with fantasy managers? I can't think of any other way to categorize his decisions in a rational way. Um, so yeah, I mean, who knows? But like I said, I'm buying, and I think all these guys eventually are going to work out. It's just not a great situation right now. But hey, maybe if they keep losing games, they'll find themselves with a new coach. They'll find themselves with a promising rookie quarterback, and everything will be solved for us. Yeah.
Yeah, let's hope so, because according to Arthur Smith, they don't care. Ask Drake London. He does
They
not
don't
care
care.
that he doesn't get targets.
He doesn't care. I'm sure it won't affect his second contract or anything like that. No, he does not care.
He does not care.
He is, when he sees Johnny Smith get his third designed screen of the game, he is just absolutely hyped out of his mind, I'm sure.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're gonna move on here to our next segment, which is just classic kind of buy sell segment. But before we get into it and talk about a few players, I do want to ask you a little bit about your process, because you have a very refined type of process where you prospect players and you put them into groups. And I won't explain it for the listeners, but I would love to get kind of a high level view of how you approach the game, and how you sort of differentiate between different tiers of players or asset classes and things like that.
Yeah, I think the first thing is that when I was making this, it was all because when people talk fantasy football, there's, even if you have people that believe they know the right answers or the wrong answers, in reality, we don't know anything. And so we're dealing in probabilities here. Even if there's a guy that you think is absolutely fantastic, there's still that possibility, even if it's slight, that they aren't that good. And for us to see, is it a slight probability? Is it a strong possibility or probability that he's going to be a hit, or however, or like the impact of a player hitting, what he looks like in year two. The whole idea of building this process was that we had a way to look at similar players, similar output, and get a range of outcomes. So we get, a high-end outcome, a low-end outcome, but most importantly, everything in between that shows, okay, is this a guy who's probably going to hit, or is there just a few good examples or good comparisons that you can find, but the rest leave us, with a low probability or risk, I should say. So the whole idea of starting this, so like when we talk about prospects, we're bucketing them using, peripherals or metrics that are sticky or correlate to future success in terms of prospects. And we put that together in a score, and then we kind of run the score through a few other variables, and then we get this prospect bucket. So like, for example, like running backs, like here's all our first round elite bell cows, and you get a list of like 12 names or something. And you can be like, okay, these are all similar comparable players. Were there any, downsides that happen to this? What bet am I making? And so it's more of a way for me to just, or us or the viewer, whoever it is, look at this and say, okay, I can see what it's like, or I can see the probabilities in front of me. I'm not just seeing a 1-for-1 comp or something like that, to where you can point to and say, okay, I kind of understand why it didn't work out, or wow, this seems like quite a wild story that it didn't work out, or it did work out,
Yeah, being able to see things in terms of ranges of outcomes. I think that's definitely how I like to play, but I don't have it as kind of orderly and organized as you do. I love those graphics that you post on Twitter where you kind of have your players and you're showing like these are all these similar players that fit the same mold, and you can see like who are the hits and who are the misses, and it does give you a much better idea of like what you're getting yourself into, and I'm sure that that's helpful for you, as you're navigating the season, as you're trading for players, you're trading away players, because you still have this idea of like what is the ceiling outcome and what is the floor outcome. So could you speak a little bit to, when you're going to make a trade, when you're going to buy a player, or you create content, if you're highlighting somebody that's a buy or a sell, are there certain things that you're looking for with those players?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, when we're looking at value, like, is you use things like Keep Trade Cut, Fantasy Trade Calc, where you could get a general consensus of like, who are my league mates or my consensus league mates? Where do they have these guys valued? Is there an approach where I could take a bet that doesn't seem like, if it pays off, that it's going to have as high of an impact because of those similar players, versus someone who's maybe a little cheaper, or you could get a little plus on, or you could just trade it 1-for-1, where the probability is either higher, or the impact of them hitting, we've seen it happen before, where the ceiling is legitimately greater. because I think that's one thing in fantasy that kind of gets thrown around is ceiling or upside play, because in all reality, most players have a pretty high upside or any sort of upside, however you may word it. We have a way of looking at, impacts and probabilities, and then we can compare that to value, which is the most important part. Because we can, make an example and say, we love the easiest one, like Jamar Chase. Like, the probabilities are insane. His peripherals look good. Well, but you can't really buy him because everyone already knows that. Consensus has already figured that out. So I think one guy who, spoiler for later in one of our segments, is someone like Puka Nacua, where you look at the probabilities and you're like, wow, this actually looks really good despite, a poor prospect profile, because of what he's done in the first 8 games and what rookies have also been able to do something similar. And they're all very strong hits, even if they didn't have draft capital or wherever it may be. And then you're looking at someone who's valued, outside the top 12 wide receivers. On Fantasy Trade Calc, I saw him at like wide receiver 20 today. And so you're kind of looking at somewhere that probability or that impact of him hitting is just much greater than what consensus says. And that's where you start to form your buys. And then the opposite of that would be how you kind of consume or find your sells.
Yeah, I like that explanation for sure. Because I think upside is one of the things that people have the most trouble quantifying, and that includes me. Like, just as an example, like Sam Howell right now is, I think he's the QB6 on the season. I don't think that's points per game. It's overall, but he's up there. And for me, like looking at somebody like that before the season, I saw there was rushing potential, and I thought, okay, if he's going to hit a ceiling, like he's probably going to have some rushing touchdowns, kind of a Daniel Jones-esque rushing profile. And he could maybe be a low end QB1, but instead he's hardly run at all. And he's actually outpaced what I thought was like a reasonable ceiling for him. And it's because he's leading the NFL in pass attempts. But like, that's not something people were talking about. Like, nobody was like, oh man, you got to get on this Washington offense. Like, Sam Howell is going to just throw the ball like crazy, 40 attempts per game. So I think just a lot of the times we don't fully understand what the range of outcomes is. And I know that's not really a prospect thing. It's more of an offense thing, but we don't want to think that we know more than we do. We don't want to over assume what we know about certain players. Amon-Ra St. Brown is kind of an example as a prospect where, I don't know, it seemed like a low upside guy, right? Like mostly a slot receiver, goes to the 4th round. Like, what's really the ceiling on a guy like that if he hits? Well, apparently it's a lot higher than we thought, right? He's just dominating targets at a rate we couldn't expect. And Puka Nacua seems like maybe kind of a second coming of that type of profile. So that has been pretty interesting. And we'll definitely talk about Puka again later. We're doing some dynasty risers. But I had a few players here. I want to know what your process or your model thinks of these guys, and see if we're on the same page, because I kind of have my lean with these players of what I'm trying to do with them. And I'd love to know if we are in sync here. The first one is Chris Olave, who has been kind of frustrating as an asset to own this season. I can speak from experience because he's one of my most rostered wide receivers. And I mean, phenomenal rookie season, very good target earner. Really, really broke out as a rookie. Probably deserved offensive rookie of the year, if you ask me. Outperformed Garrett Wilson in a lot of metrics. But this year, I mean, the peripherals are still there for the most part, but the production just has not been. And for me, like, this looks like a really big buy window kind of opening up with him, where we're not getting the ceiling games, but he's still kind of commanding those targets, and it all looks like it's there and it'll come together eventually. It just hasn't yet. How do you view Chris Olave as an asset? Like, is this somebody that you would be targeting in deals, or somebody you think maybe you'd rather pivot to some other options and try to get out from him?
I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of him being someone who's probably much closer to a buy, despite him still being a pretty high valued wide receiver, than he is a sell. Because coming into this year, which, he wasn't a terrific prospect, but what he did as a rookie is where you could start to pivot all your prior thinking. You aren't looking at him as a prospect anymore. You have this rookie who put up a 25% target share on a 14 plus average depth of target, which is susceptible to fantasy points within itself, because you don't need to have a massive amount of targets, even though that's still a high ceiling, for that to be susceptible to high fantasy success, because the targets that you're getting are much more inducive to fantasy production than if you have, an average depth of target of like 6 or 8 or something, where it's closer to the line of scrimmage. because, well, when you can earn such a strong volume of targets deeper downfield, you're prone to having high fantasy success. Now, this year, as someone who was a strong candidate for wide receiver 3 in Dynasty for me, I don't feel that way, but he hasn't fallen all that far. Like, yes, his efficiency has been poor, and Derek Carr, for the most part, has actually been a pretty poor quarterback. He's had a couple good recent weeks or solid recent weeks, but his peripherals are also looking worse than they did in Vegas or Oakland. So it's not like Derek Carr in this offense has been humming, and then Chris Olave's efficiency has dropped. But I think that's a good part of the reason why Chris Olave's efficiency has dropped. When we look at Chris Olave for part of the reasons we liked, he was a high target earner deep down the field. This year, he's still 24.8% target share. That's solid. And he's doing it on an average depth of target of 13.3. So even if the efficiency and stuff are down, that's quite good. I mean, when we look at second-year wide receivers to put up a 24% plus target share on an average depth of target of at least 13, we're talking Calvin Johnson, Justin Jefferson, DeAndre Hopkins, A.J. Green, Mike Evans, Sammy Watkins, Allen Robinson, Alshon Jeffrey, Marquise Brown, and Josh Gordon. Like, even the worst examples of that are still pretty highly valued dynasty assets that are productive. Like, the worst one on this list is Marquise Brown, and he hovers between wide receiver 20 and wide receiver 45 for the rest of the time is what it feels like. He's still someone who's has solid value. And if like you're looking at this, now this isn't like a true range of outcomes, but if you were looking at this in a true range of outcomes, if out of all those examples where all but 3 have a top 5 18 plus point per game season, if your worst example is someone like a Marquise Brown, that tells you that the risk for what you're putting in is probably not too great, because to this point, we already have proof that Chris Olave is good. And we even have more proof that he has a high ceiling. We just need that efficiency to follow. And it did last year. He was one of the most efficient wide receivers in the league. So we have a sample size of him actually being an efficient wide receiver. So you can kind of point to this being regression while still being in a very high susceptible role. And so I'm with you. I think he's more of a buy than he is a sell right now.
Yeah, I think this range of wide receivers, these high-end wide receivers in Dynasty, is like very volatile. It's very recency oriented, not in the sense that the guys will actually like fall out of a tier or fall, too far, but they just kind of climb over each other week after week, whoever had the big week or whoever's running hot on efficiency. It was Olave early in the year. Like, he had some big games. He didn't score the touchdowns, but he was getting the targets. It was like, okay, this is a great role for him. And then Garrett Wilson lost Aaron Rodgers, and CeeDee Lamb was kind of slow. And so he was kind of creeping up there. And now things have shifted back the last few weeks. He's had some pretty rough games in terms of catchable targets. He's also had some drops in recent weeks. So it's just, he's still getting volume, but there's been some things kind of suppressing the actual production. He did find the end zone this past week, which certainly helps his point totals, and that helps his market value. But yeah, this is a guy that I'm going to be sending out some offers for, because I still think he's in that tier with Garrett Wilson, Amon-Ra St. Brown. I think those guys are still kind of in a tier together under the big two. And I just want to buy in on the guys that are suppressed in value when they are, because I think Olave is going to have his turn to move back up again. Maybe it won't be this year. Maybe they need a quarterback change or something, but I do think better days are ahead for him. Now, there's another wide receiver that's kind of been the opposite this year. Really efficient player. He's been kind of boosting his way up the rankings, but he's a little bit older. Brandon Aiyuk is, I believe he's 25 years old, 25 or 26. I think he's 25. Let's see. Should have checked. Yeah, he's 25. He'll be 26 this offseason. So he's been in the league a little bit longer, but he's really brought himself up to kind of another level this year, much higher target share than we've seen from him in the past. And I actually heard someone today say they might actually prefer Brandon Aiyuk to Chris Olave in Dynasty. And I'm definitely not there, but I've got one eyebrow raised at Brandon Aiyuk. What do you think about him? Is this a situation where maybe we can sell him off of this, recent stretch of production and this perceived breakout? Or is this something we want to buy into and maybe just keep buying as he rises up the ranks?
I don't think that Brandon Aiyuk and Chris Olave are too far off as wide receiver assets in Dynasty in terms of, I don't think trading one for the other is anything crazy to me. And I wouldn't lean one way or the other and say, wow, that's a great trade, or wow, that's a great move. Because I think it's pretty close. It's more of a lateral move. Now, when we look at Brandon Aiyuk, yes, he's running very hot and he's been very good with his efficiency this year. And specifically, he's earning a lot of targets. Now, the thing is with Aiyuk, I think we have enough of a sample size of him being really good in a not ideal situation, given, the other hogs or target earners around him, as well as being just a low volume offense in general. But the thing is, so this range of outcomes, like that we've talked about, I build this thing called Ruse, a range of outcomes, and it takes a player and it goes for wide receivers specifically, it goes through into their fourth year before it either is determined that the sample or the players that it's giving you in terms of outcomes is just too small for it to be beneficial, or we just essentially know who that player is at this point, which is mostly the case. Now, Brandon Aiyuk, he was really unique in that he didn't have a lot of outcomes or player outcomes because it's something where it takes your first year data, your second year data, your third year data, and compares it to people of that season. Now, I know Brandon Aiyuk had a very strong rookie year, and then he had the very weird second year where he was in the doghouse. He wasn't getting on the field as much as he should have, especially early. And then it kind of creates kind of a wonky, career arc. But yet in this range of outcomes, he gets one player who matches his first year, second year, third year close enough to put it in its outcome, and it's Cooper Kupp. So we knew going into this season that Brandon Aiyuk is someone who could be very good, and we've seen it before. So seeing Brandon Aiyuk, while maybe this wasn't the most likely outcome or anything, see him be one of PFF's best receivers of the 2023 season. His efficiency is ridiculous with 3.15 yards per team pass attempt, one of the best and the highest marks in the league. And then you've got, if AJ Brown and Tyreek Hill weren't amazing, Brandon Aiyuk would have the highest in the league. And then he has a 26.4% target share, which for most of the games has been next to guys like Christian McCaffrey, Deebo Samuel, George Kittle. And he's putting up 15.6 points per game on an offense throwing under 30 pass attempts per game. So I think everything with Brandon Aiyuk is legitimate, even if there's some regression involved. But his profile is pointed to him being quite good, even in a down season. The peripherals pointed to him being a really good receiver. And now we're seeing the really good receiver. So we have reason to believe that this is legitimate. And I'm going to choose to say that it's legitimate as well. I think he's fine at his current value, even if it is a dynasty wide receiver one, although I know his value's on the fringe of it. So he actually becomes closer to a buy for me than a sell. But one of those things where we probably want to see him in a situation where the team will at least throw 35 pass attempts a game, because then what is Brandon Aiyuk doing?
Right. I think that, the volume is an issue. That's kind of why I've been hesitant, like a 25-year-old wide receiver scoring, he's under 16 points per game, even with these peripheral numbers. But like you said, a lot of it is the overall pass attempts in the offense. Definitely bought in on him as a great player. He's actually probably showing me more this year than I thought. I didn't know if he could necessarily be like that elite target earner. But he has been that. Debo's missed some time, but even still, even in the games that they were both playing together, for the most part, it's been the Aiyuk show this year. This is something where a lot of the numbers are pointing towards it. Like you said, the PFF grade, Matt Harmon has always absolutely loved Brandon Aiyuk, with the reception perception grades. So I think we have to buy into this as real. My concern about paying the full price tag on him is just like, if he does end up in San Francisco perpetually, maybe we never do get that kind of high end season, because he's pretty close to maxed out at what he's doing right now. But we don't know that that's the case. We don't want to prioritize situation over talent. So I like what you're saying here. I'm still gonna take Olave, but if we're thinking about what else we could offer for Brandon Aiyuk to try to make this a little bit more actionable, I know you do rankings, so you probably have some idea. What sorts of assets do you think people should try to send out? If they're looking to add Brandon Aiyuk, as he's continuing to ascend his way up into the top 12.
Yeah, I think you could throw pieces out there that I'd be completely fine trading away for Brandon Aiyuk, or like Zay Flowers, as good as he's been. I think that you could flip him for Brandon Aiyuk and get better production and a more safe and stable asset. Especially when, as good as Zay Flowers has been, there's still a little bit of risk in the profile in terms of the high impact point production that you want. I think someone like T. Higgins, who is very solid, but also someone who's probably not going to be in one of the best situations like he's been with the Cincinnati Bengals when we look at next year. And he's not one of those, at least with Jamar Chase. He hasn't been an alpha target earner. He hasn't produced at the level that Brandon Aiyuk currently is. And actually, for most of the season, he's been pretty poor in what's been a pretty solid offense as of late. So I think T. Higgins is a good name to throw out there. Even if you could do like Michael Pittman Jr. plus a 4, that's also something that I'm interested in to get my hands on Brandon Aiyuk.
Yeah, I like those names. I've always kind of viewed like a lot of those guys, not Zay Flowers as a rookie, but Higgins, Pittman, Ayuk as kind of in similar buckets in terms of like their profiles as target earners and everything. But Ayuk has really kind of put himself a cut above the rest. Higgins is interesting because half the people you talk to will say that he's actually going to be in a better situation when he leaves Cincinnati because he's going to be the number one. And then other people say, well, he's going to be in a worse situation because he's going to probably have a worse quarterback and probably be in an offense that throws less. I tend to be in your camp. Most of the places he could end up are probably going to be a downgrade. People are talking about like Tennessee having a lot of cap room and he's from Tennessee. Apparently, maybe he goes there. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe if Will Levis works out and he's like a superstar quarterback, that could be fun. But I think Ayuk, you know what you're getting. Like at worst, he's going to be back in San Francisco. That's probably like your worst case scenario. And even that is like, you're getting a very useful player at that point. But what if he does leave and go to an offense that isn't 30th in pass attempts and, he's able to bring that target share somewhere else? I think there is a high ceiling there. So I like those options. If you look across positions, maybe somebody like Kenneth Walker. Would you rather have Brandon Ayuk than Kenneth Walker in Dynasty?
Yeah, I think I would. Even though Kenneth Walker plays a little bit more of a premium position,
Mhm.
I think when you talk about stability, true upside, I think it points to Aiyuk. So if they're about similar value, I'm fine with Aiyuk there. But I think in most leagues, you should be able to get a decent little plus on Aiyuk or some sort of package that favors an Aiyuk side with the remaining pieces. But yeah, that's something I'd do.
Yeah, I just realized Walker was the next guy here I wanted to talk about, and they are kind of finding their way into similar ranges here. Walker's had a couple of rough games, which doesn't necessarily help your trade discussions, but he certainly was coming from a higher valued position coming into the year. So it just kind of depends on your league and like what are how closely are managers holding on to their priors with these players. But yeah, I think I'd be pushing towards the Ayuk side there. Zay Flowers was an interesting one. Yeah, Flowers. Would you feel the same about Jordan Addison? Like, would you make that
I,
same move or?
I think I want Jordan Addison in that situation, especially when we look, because in the offseason, we typically see year 2 players once people have seen, okay, this rookie does this, and we know second year players blow up. Like Jordan Addison is someone who could most definitely just be a wide receiver 1 in the offseason because people are so excited for year 2,
Yeah.
especially if the quarterback situation gets a little better than Josh Dobbs, which it likely does. But yeah, I think I hold on to Jordan Addison in there.
Gotcha. I was curious. Yeah, I assume your process probably likes Jordan Addison's profile a lot more than Flowers. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I was definitely Addison over Flowers. I think they're pretty close for me now, but I yeah, I tend to lean a little more towards Addison just with the kind of the cleaner profile, just more stereotypical, successful kind of looking wide receiver. Don't think you can necessarily go wrong between the two, but Ayuk is right there with those guys, and I'd be pretty tempted to just take the guy that I already know what he is. So that would be interesting. But sticking with Kenneth Walker, we've seen Zach Charbonnet lead the team in snaps the last 2 weeks. Walker's still getting more of the touches overall, but this is kind of what people were worried about when they took Charbonnet in the second round. I think it was delayed because Charbonnet had that injury in the offseason. Pete Carroll maybe just wanted to kind of ramp him up slowly, but he's certainly becoming a thorn in the side of Kenneth Walker. And if I was rostering him in any leagues, I would be nervous. I didn't really believe in Walker as like an all around running back, like a guy that has that true every down upside. Christian McCaffrey's obviously the gold standard, but guys like even what I thought from Travis Etienne or Brees Hall, anything like that. I didn't think Walker was ever going to reach that point. I think he's more of a limited player. He does some things very well, but he clearly has some deficiencies in his game. And I think the Seahawks want to use Charbonnet to kind of mask some of those weaknesses. So are you kind of worried about how the last 2 weeks have gone for Walker? Have they shifted your perspective on him at all? Or were you kind of already out ahead of this?
Yeah, so the last couple of weeks, while it hasn't been ideal for Kenneth Walker, he's someone where it hasn't really changed much for me because Kenneth Walker, I've continued to find myself lower than consensus on him. But part of that reason, if we look from just a profile standpoint, Kenneth Walker is a good rusher. He proved that last year. That's something as a prospect, you needed him to be a good rusher because he has one of the worst receiving profiles that we've had come into the draft in terms of top 1 and 2 round picks in terms of prospects. So not someone that we expected to catch passes. And as a rookie, most definitely didn't. But he showed that he was a good rusher. Now, the problem with someone like that is if they're not going to get into that 10 to 12% target share range out of the backfield, top 12 production, let alone top 5, is hard to get to because you have to be a really efficient rusher and you have to be put in positions where you can get lots of touchdowns. Mm-hmm. So we talk about a profile like Kenneth Walker. I almost feel the same way now that I did going into the season because Zach Charbonnet is getting, worked into it. And when we talk about Kenneth Walker, he is someone that we've seen from prospect profile rookie year. And now 8-9 games into his second season, we're still just looking at a 7.7% target share. It's not adequate enough to give you a true boost without superstar rushing peripherals. And for there to be superstar rushing peripherals, that means you have to have a very, very high carry percentage. You have to eat a bulk of the load, be very efficient with it, and also get a good amount of touchdowns. And now we have another second-round running back behind him in Charbonnet, who at this point is now getting worked in more. As you said, he outsnapped Kenneth Walker. So now you have a running back that to have at least high-end production, which at his value you kind of need or want him to have, you need a very high carry percentage with strong efficiency. And you have someone now that's eating into it, and you don't have that receiving work to really, boost a floor. Like total opposites, like when we talk about Jahmyr Gibbs, that's why he's completely fine, even when David Montgomery comes back, because he's one of the best receivers out of the backfield that we've seen from a prospect standpoint, and just what he's done so far as rookie season. It's almost the complete opposite.
Yeah. So when we look at the last couple of weeks, Walker, he was down to 44% of running back rushes and then 62%. The weeks before that, he only had 1 week under 70% before that, before week 8 and week 9. We also see Zach Charbonnet taking 100% of the 2-minute drill snaps, 100% of the long down and distance snaps. These are snaps where running backs have an opportunity to maybe catch some passes. Walker being off the field for those definitely doesn't help him. So there's just not a lot of path. Like, I think it's clear that he is a talented running back who's probably going to be around for a while, but unless he falls into like a perfect situation at some point, he's just not going to be able to deliver that high end upside that you're really looking for. And so if you're trying to, invest in a player for longevity's sake, you don't really want that to be a running back because it's so unpredictable. The injuries really tend to pile up and the position is just very volatile in general. So if you're not going to be able to get that immediate boom production from a running back, the player is typically overvalued. Like we don't want to be buying into running backs for what they could do for us in the future. And right now, it doesn't really seem like we're going to be able to get that league-winning upside from him. So I only possessed one Kenneth Walker share this season, and I traded him away on Sunday, like 5 minutes into the game. I pulled a trade. I sent Walker and my first, which is currently I'm the 4th seed, for Christian McCaffrey. I was like, you know what? Let's just push the chips in. I'm kind of skeeved out by Walker's usage lately. Let me just go get the biggest cheat code in fantasy football. And, let's hope he can stay healthy for a few weeks. So I moved on from my one share. I don't have to sweat it anymore, but I would be exploring the deals that you can make while he still possesses value like that. So
I like that move that you did right there. And I was also one that only had one Kenneth Walker share going into the season. And a few weeks ago, I traded it with another contender. So I'm a contender in this league. I traded it with the 2 seed. I was the 3 seed. So especially a few weeks ago, there's still a bit of jumbling, like both top 3 in points for. But I took Kenneth Walker, traded him straight up 1-for-1 for Devin Achane. And I think that is still viable looking at current values and fantasy trade calc. I still think that that's a viable move you can make on this day, but that is something that I still have no regrets about, despite that, most people may say, or some people may say, you were a contender and you took Kenneth Walker out of your lineup and gave him to another contender. I'm not too worried about that because my team is strong enough to overcome it. I'm still in the running for the buys. And when HN returns, like we talked about, you have actual very, very legitimate and league-winning upside at the position. That it's almost like I took a 4-month hiatus from a running back 2 in Walker, took a little downgrade to replacement production, which Walker in the last few weeks has been just above that, if that. And now I'm going to have a player who has possible 25 point per game output in the final stretch of the season.
I can't believe you traded away Kenneth Walker's 3-point performance in week 9. How are you going to survive? No, I always love when it's like you're making these dynasty trades that like will echo out into perpetuity with their impact. And it's like, oh my gosh, but what about this week? Like, what about the one guy that you aren't going to be able to play this week? Like I really like that trade, by the way, but this just reminded me that I had a deal in place to trade Trevor Lawrence and a late first for Lamar Jackson and a 2025 second. And I was like trying to get Lamar Jackson. And like I wanted to use him this week because I had to play Zach Wilson in my super flex. But the guy was like, I need to play Lamar this week, so I can't make the trade right now. And I'm like, I'm just thinking about the impact of this trade. We're trading like top 8 dynasty assets. Like this is like a blockbuster deal. And he's like, no, I have to play Lamar this week. And then Lamar scores him 10 points. And it's like, yeah, I mean, maybe these things just these 1 week samples aren't that important. And you can kind of get by. But yeah, I like that. I like that deal. I definitely prefer Achane. I think, like you said, the upside is there. You know, it's scary because we haven't seen it over a long sample, but I've seen enough from him. I was a big believer in his prospect profile. It was just like, if a team's willing to give him the work at his size, I think he'll produce. And he's been really impressive. And so I think once he's back, you know, I think he could absolutely be an impact player down the stretch. So that's,
I think
it's pretty cool.
Not to, add on and by talking about HM, but I do think that while obviously he's not going to be a guy who's getting 12 yards per carry over a longer stretch, I think this is someone that you can absolutely say you have a sample to, even, the slight sample we got in his rookie year, and look at his prospect profile and say, wow, he is just one of the most efficient running backs. Because one thing that's cool is you look at his first year at Texas A&M, he doesn't get a whole lot of work by any stretch of the imagination. I think he was like 8th or something in rushing yards, yet the highest yards per carry on the team. So the most efficient rusher in a very small workload. Then you go to his next year where he has a much higher workload and he's second fiddle to Isaiah Spiller, and he's still the most efficient running back on the team, even amongst guys who had small samples. Mm-hmm. Then you go to this last year where he was a true bell cow in terms of his usage, and he remained the most efficient rusher of the football on Texas A&M. And then he goes to essentially the best running back rushing fit you can get in the NFL with the Dolphins. And now you're looking at someone who, there is enough of a sample to say, yeah, he's not 12 yards per carry guy, but everything we've seen since he stepped foot on Texas A&M is that he's one of the most efficient rushers on the field.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you don't have to convince me, but I'm totally with you there. I mean, I think he's a great buy if you can still get him. He's on bye this week, and then he's supposed to be back. So if people are still not totally up on Devon Achane and don't really understand what they have in him, like this is kind of your last chance to try to get in before he returns to the field. Keeping the conversation in the rookie zone, we're going to move on from the buys and sells and just have a little discussion about some of these rookie quarterbacks, because I'd love to know where they settle in for you in your rankings. We just saw CJ Stroud throw 5 touchdowns and have an absolutely just insane performance. I think it was like the best rookie quarterback performance in, I don't know, I'm forgetting the stat now, maybe ever. I don't know, at least in like the last 5 years or something. 400 something passing yards, 5 passing touchdowns. And now the question is, where does CJ Stroud fit into dynasty quarterback rankings? I've seen some people say that he's a top 5 quarterback now. When I sit down and look at the list, I don't really see how that math adds up, but maybe you can walk me through it. Where does CJ Stroud fit into your quarterback ranks?
Yeah. So to your point, it was probably it was the best fantasy performance we've ever had from a rookie quarterback. Like, even if you go back past, my database goes 2006, but I try to use StatHead to get 6-point passing and go far back. You cannot find anyone that had a 50-point game in 6-point passing that CJ Stroud did. And he did it with just one rushing point. Yeah. So it's someone, it honestly is the best rookie performance we've basically ever seen. Like that was fantastic. And if you weren't in on CJ Stroud before, who already had very strong peripherals, you absolutely have to be now. And he's clearly going to be a top high end asset in Dynasty. But to your point, when you talk about, people talking about him in the top 5, it's really hard to see that math because I'm busting out the 33rd ranks for this week in terms of quarterback. And I elevated CJ Stroud into a tier with Herbert, Burrow, and Lamar. But there's no way that you can really put him above those guys. Because when you're talking about the top 6 dynasty quarterbacks, I'm sure we're in congruence here that we're talking Mahomes, Hurts, Allen, and then Herbert, Burrow, Lamar. I just don't see a feasible way to put CJ Stroud, despite one of the best performances we've had, not just for a rookie, but lately. You still can't put him above one of those guys who have proven that they have top 5 and legitimate upside in long seasons. I think CJ Stroud, could find himself in an argument with one of those guys, but I don't think that time is now.
Yeah, I agree with you that he belongs like in that tier at the end of it. We've seen Burrow and Herbert do this type of stuff too in stretches, and it's not like they've gotten worse at playing football. It's more so, we haven't seen either of them drop a 50-point game in recent weeks. And so it's like, okay, well, let's just make the swap now. But I mean, if we think about it logically, like age isn't a factor for any of these guys. Burrow and Herbert should still project for more fantasy points rest of season than CJ Stroud. Like he's still a rookie quarterback. He's still going to have some bumps and bruises. Those guys have better weapons than him. So if they're all in the same tier, but 2 of them are going to be better options for this season moving forward, then it makes sense to rank them ahead. And we've also just seen a longer sample from those guys. Like we know what they are as dynasty assets. And I'm very confident in CJ Stroud, but it just doesn't make sense to take the 6 game or the 9 game sample over the, multiple season sample. So I think people will just, it's just a better looking tweet to say that he's top 5 than to be like, he's in the same tier as the top 5 or whatever. I think that's more so what's going on. It doesn't really work out. I would not be trading away Burrow or Herbert for Stroud, although I do think that the gap is shrinking rapidly.
Yeah, I don't think there's really any reason to actually have CJ Stroud in your top 5 ahead of one of those guys. There's really just no reason for it other than being different. Like I know that can sound harsh because everyone has different processes, but in all cases, there's really no point to rush yourself ahead of quarterbacks that you already know have elite ceilings, elite likely production rest of season, and our age is not a question with these guys. And I think the other thing too is with Herbert and Burrow, we've actually seen them rush for much higher output than CJ Stroud has, which gives them even more of a boost. Like when Joe Burrow was healthy last year, 3.5 rushing points per game. Justin Herbert this year, 3.7 rushing points per game. And CJ Stroud right now is at 1.7, and that's basically better than any year he had at Ohio State. So, I mean, even when you're talking about those tiebreakers, it goes there. It almost kind of feels like when someone makes a quarterback ranking and then they just don't put Mahomes at 1 because they want to be different or fun or whatever it is, it kind of feels like one of those situations.
Yeah, I agree with you. I do want to look at the other side of it for a second, and I have to shout out Jacob Sanderson because he was on this weeks ago, and he was saying, look, sometime soon, at least by the end of the season, CJ Stroud is going to find himself in a tier with Burrow, Herbert, Trevor Lawrence. We've already seen what he can do. It's just a matter of time. So if you can go and trade one of those guys down into CJ Stroud and pick up a nice plus, that could really help you out in Dynasty. And now if you think about, if you had gone and sent, like, especially Trevor Lawrence, like if you could have sent Trevor Lawrence for CJ Stroud plus a first, or like CJ Stroud plus an early second or some wide receiver or something, you'd be feeling pretty good about that right now. So I think that was a good call. But it's also possible there are some leagues where you can still use the name brand equity of those quarterbacks to tier down into CJ Stroud. And that's something I would be interested in doing. I'm not going to 1-for-1 swap them. I'm not going to put Stroud ahead of Burrow or Herbert, but I'll absolutely entertain some offers. Like if you're sending me Stroud plus something for Burrow, I'm very interested in listening to that. What would be the tipping point for you in that type of a deal? What would you want to get back to just feel comfortable making that swap?
Yeah, I think one thing that people kind of do too much in Dynasty is they go, I want a plus, and then they almost don't care what the plus is.
Yeah.
Like in most cases, like I'm not looking, even if value says it's the same, like taking, Joe Burrow and flipping him into CJ Stroud and getting an extra third. Because in reality, especially with assets of that magnitude, that third is not moving any needle for you to
Yeah.
where it's good looking or anything like that. But if you could take a package and make it a little bigger, so like you have Lamar Jackson, for example, and you got this mid-second, you could flip it for CJ Stroud and a first, and all of a sudden now the plus that you have, well, you gave up a little bit, you upgraded into another more premium asset. And I think that's one thing that, dynasty community as a whole could get a lot better in, is everyone likes to say, get this, and you could get a plus on top. But I think the most important part is what you're getting in that plus and how you're getting it. Because I don't like making moves where the plus that I'm getting for essentially going down in the tier or whatever it may be, or tiering down, is nothing that moves realistic needles or turns into a very high risk in terms of, the value that you actually want.
Yeah, I love the idea of a first second swap. Obviously the number of leagues where you can pull that off is smaller than it was a week ago, but it's probably still out there, and I would definitely explore that if it's possible to kind of extract that value with Stroud and pocket the difference. So that's been great. It's been all sunshine and rainbows for CJ Stroud. Not such a great time to be a Panthers fan. You are trending towards the sending the number one overall pick to Chicago so that you could get Bryce Young, and he's been rough. I don't know if you do the same kind of like range of outcomes with quarterbacks and like looking at their statistical production or whatever, but man, I'd be hard pressed to find a lot of quarterbacks that played the way that he's played through half a season that really turned into stars. Where are you at with Bryce Young? Is this kind of like, let's just take it slow and see what happens? Or is this like, are we pushing any panic buttons or anything with Bryce Young, or looking for the ejector button?
Honestly, I'm just sitting tight with Bryce Young, especially as, the value starts to kind of really fall beneath him, because I think looking into the offseason, it's one thing where the value's never going to go too far. Like, one of my favorite things is talk about the safety of rookie quarterbacks. Like, even Zach Wilson in his atrocious season had pretty similar value despite being a little bit lower going into year two, where rookie quarterbacks just hold it because they are rookie quarterbacks. We don't see CJ Strouds every year. We typically get, production that's not so great, and we're looking for the second year for the quarterback that's a rookie to really evolve. I also think there's no way you can look at Bryce Young, at least from an analytical point of view, and not see him as an elite prospect for what he was. He produced every year at Alabama. He declared early, like you just mentioned. You said, has there actually been someone who's produced this poorly and been just fine? And to that, I'll say we've had 3 rookie quarterbacks who are also elite prospects that had less than 15 points per game. Bryce Young's currently at 14. And you get Matthew Stafford, Trevor Lawrence, and Justin Fields. Now, obviously, Justin Fields is a little bit different because he's still just been a terrible passer, and it's been the rushing production that's lifted him. But you could even say Trevor Lawrence is a little bit different because, the terrible coaching or whatever. But let's take like Matthew Stafford, for example. Matthew Stafford has passed for 12.9 points per game as a rookie. Bryce Young this season, 12.7. Bryce Young has one of the worst PFF passing grades. Well, Matthew Stafford as a rookie had a 45.8 PFF passing grade. So it's one of those things where, yes, it is absolutely not ideal to see Bryce Young like this, but the value, it's still heavily insulated. It's not going to go too far, and you don't really get anything great out of moving off of Bryce Young unless you're just some clear-cut contender and you want, Dak Prescott, Jared Goff production. I'm guessing around that value, maybe closer to Jared Goff. Like maybe that's a move you want to make, and I'm not against it. I have Jared Goff like same tier, but one spot higher in the rankings. But Bryce Young is someone who I'm not looking to sell. I think he's completely fine. And he's an elite prospect who's having just a bad rookie season, which isn't out of the norm for rookie quarterbacks.
Yeah, I think that's the rational take, especially the value installation piece. We are quick to forget how high Zach Wilson was going entering his second season when, it felt like the writing was on the wall and it didn't matter. People were still going to buy in. And I think we will see that with Bryce Young, even if there is a bit of a dip throughout the rest of this season. I think as you get into the offseason, there's going to be enough narratives of like, Bryce Young looks like he's way more in control of the offense, or, they get an upgraded wide receiver or something like that, and people are going to want to buy back in on him. So there is a lot of security there. The interesting question for me, I guess, is comparing him to another rookie quarterback who's just having a much different journey in Will Levis, where not touted at the same level as a prospect, obviously goes in the second round, gets injured in the offseason. And so he's not ready to start the year. He's not even the backup. Malik Willis is the backup. But then Tannehill's out and they turn to Will Levis. And the guy goes absolutely nuts in his first game. He throws 4 touchdowns. He was obviously way over his like expected fantasy points in that game, but he also had some just unbelievable throws. And I'm not a film guy, so I'm a little bit out of sorts with Will Levis, and I don't know what to do with him because by all accounts, he seems to be handling himself well on the field. He definitely has like physical tools, even a little bit of mobility that he hasn't really used yet, but he does have. So how do you handle somebody like that in Dynasty who just sort of comes out of nowhere?
Yeah, I think we talked about earlier in the show how, when it comes to players or fantasy players, if you will, you have to be okay being wrong. Because one of the biggest things you could do in Dynasty, as well, especially Dynasty, is just knowing when to pivot. When do I change my prior beliefs? When do I change my priors? Because that's one of the most important things is you're going to get guys wrong. Guys' range of outcomes are going to change. But I think most, like, of all positions, quarterback, you have to prepare yourself to be wrong at most times. Because one thing that I've seen with Will Levis is, like, I made a post about his first game and just simply like actually how good it was from a passing point of view. And I didn't like Will Levis coming in, especially when he fell to the second round. The hit rate's pretty terrible. But I think one of the worst things you could say in that situation is, and I saw it in my comments, was I've been out on Will Levis since before the draft. Okay, well, you didn't have to like Levis then. I didn't like Levis either, especially at projected value. And I definitely didn't like him after he got drafted, looking at projected value. But then you have to look, now we have a 2-game sample size. And his peripherals are actually pretty solid. 21 passing points per game in them. Granted, there's that big game, but that's all part of it, especially in NFL debut. You can't just say take out his NFL debut. Like, that's supposed to be really bad. And he at this point, 5.9% touchdown rate, 7.9 adjusted yards per attempt, 71.5 PFF passing grade. Like, everything's pointing in a pretty solid direction. And then today it was announced that he was the starter. So he's basically the starter the rest of the season. So it's not like Tannehill's going to come back and take his job back and Levis is no longer starting. So now I have a quarterback who's going to start. His early passing peripherals have been good, and you have to be okay being wrong when it comes to quarterback evaluations. Now, it's still not someone I love, but I think there's plenty of upside there, and you don't have to put too much into it. Like I was promoting a few weeks ago, or not a few weeks ago, after his debut when looking at value. Some of the guys who I said, Will Levis is actually kind of an intriguing guy in Dynasty. If you can trade like a Jordan Love for him, who's also a risky asset, but he's in his 5th year compared to Will Levis in his first, and we've seen less of Will Levis. Or Daniel Jones. Now, obviously, that looks better now. But when Daniel Jones was about to be healthy and he didn't have the ACL thing, I think those were solid pivots for just taking the unknown at quarterback that's shown some glimpses of actually being quite good.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I try to be pretty loose with my prior opinions on quarterbacks because it's just a really hard position to scout and pin down in general. It's especially difficult to do it with data. It's just not a lot of like trends that we can pick up on a ton. We're wrong a lot, and like you said, he's had all the numbers that you really want to look for. It's just that it's only 2 games, but it's a double-edged sword because you can say, oh, you have to see more. I have to see more before I can really buy in. It's like, well, that's fine, but you're not going to gain as much from buying in once we've seen it because you're going to be paying full price. Whereas if you could have traded Jordan Love for him or Daniel Jones for him after his first game, you're looking really good because those were quarterbacks where, the upside wasn't really there in my opinion. And you're buying into a guy. Yeah, the floor might be low, but there's also this big unknown in terms of what he can be. And that potential upside just really outweighs the risk. So I actually made a deal today that has gotten very mixed reviews on Twitter. I sent Sam Howell and my 2025 2025 second, sorry, for Will Levis. And that was just a move where I didn't have a lot of shares. I believe that he has really high upside in terms of like, what can his dynasty value look like 8 weeks from now? And so I wanted to turn Howell into Levis, and I was comfortable with the plus on top, but I'm curious what you think of those 2 quarterbacks and how you think that deal shakes out.
Yeah, I actually think that's just a fine deal. I mean, with Sam Howell is another one of those things where, you have the unknown upside, except now we've seen more of Howell, and it's not amazing by any stretch of the imagination. Like you said, he's a high pass attempt merchant right now, in terms of his passing production. I think another thing about Will Levis too is his rushing production is probably going to be a bit better than it's been, considering coming into the league he was a scrambling quarterback. His carry percentage on the season is much better than it dictates in its 0.7 rushing points per game with a 15.5% carry percentage. So I think he's actually going to be a fine little boost to rushing. And if you can hit, his passing that we've seen in the first couple of games, you've probably got yourself, what looks like a really great deal by the end of the season.
Yeah, with a trade like that, it's never a good idea to try to guarantee the outcome. So it's not like I'm going to say I'm 100% going to win this trade. For me, it's all about range of outcomes. It's looking at what can I win in this deal versus what can I lose. And I can certainly lose out on Sam Howell providing this QB1 production the rest of the year. But I don't believe that I'm going to be missing out on like a multi-year star in Sam Howell. I don't believe that that's what's in his future. It's possible. I think it's possible, but I think in the median, he probably starts for a couple more years and he's fine. In the downside, the Commanders, they lose enough games that he gets replaced this offseason. I'm not totally sure. With Levis, I think he's almost certainly going to be their starter next year because of where the team's at and what he's already done so far. Investing the second pick in the second round is a little different than being drafted in the fifth round. That's a pretty significant investment. They're going to want to see what they have in him. So I'm going to have a pretty safe floor for him in the offseason where I know that he's going to have a job. And I think people's priors just aren't as strong. Like after Howell's rookie season, I think there was just sort of this anchor to his value where, we look at what he's done so far. He's been so productive in fantasy. You still can't fetch like a big return for him in Dynasty. But with Levis, I don't think there were those preconceived notions were as strong. And so we've already seen his value move so dramatically after just 2 games. I think he just has more like forward momentum in his favor. And I wanted to get out ahead of that. So can't say for sure that I'll win the deal, but that was my reasoning behind it. And that does kind of move us pretty smoothly into the Dynasty Risers that I wanted to talk about as the last segment here, because Will Levis was my first pick. I think of any Dynasty asset, I think he's the most likely to basically double his Dynasty value by the end of the year. I'm not saying he will, but I think the path is really cleared for him to do that, because if he can put together 3, 4, 5 solid games, like we've seen from him already, he's going to be worth 2 first-round picks. Like I could see him being in that early third round of startups this offseason, like pretty easily.
Yeah, I mean, just look where Jordan Love's going this past offseason. Like, just because he was a starter and there was some unknown, Will Levis is likely going to be a starter, and there's similar draft capital to Jordan Love. And there's possibly better or points to better signaling that he is going to be a good passer. And we're getting the second year boost and what it may be. So I think that's really strong right there. I like that Will Levis pick.
Yeah. What about you as somebody that you could see? It doesn't have to be like the biggest riser, but just somebody you think is going to see their value rise by the end of the year.
I think we got to go Puka Nacua, especially because I saw him at wide receiver 20 today. And I mean, it's just one of those things where it's like, this is where pivoting comes so big in Dynasty. Like Puka Nacua was not on my draft board in rookie drafts. Like 5th round bust prospect. I'm not going to take, this needle in a haystack bet, especially where it's not likely, to have high impact if it does hit, because you really are just playing just such terrible odds there. But what you can do is, okay, I didn't get Puka there. I'll buy a little higher, after we've seen a little bit in these first couple weeks, because consensus still isn't turned on to him. How long did it take consensus to get onto Amon-Ra St. Brown? Like his rookie peripherals were quite good. And even considering his prospect bucket, his range of outcomes looked really strong. But going into his second year, people weren't as bought in. Now we have Puka Nacua, and unlike Amon-Ra St. Brown, he actually started the season just being amazing. And I mean, we now have a strong sample. He's played 9 games this season. I mean, that's more than half a season for him. And he has a 30% target share. It's at 30%. He's doing it next to Cooper Kupp, which I think is the big thing. Like there's so many check things that he's just checking off. Like he's producing next to Cooper Kupp, what people were worried with before he returned. What can he do in not super great offense. Now, Ripen's a bit of a, you don't want to use that because the offense was simply incompetent. Like, they released him this week. So if that tells you anything about the quarterback play, but yeah, how often do you get not just a day 3 wide receiver? How often do you get a rookie wide receiver with a 30% target share? The answer is never. I mean, the highest ever is Odell Beckham Jr. at 28.6%. That's like Puka Nacua is higher. His yards per team pass attempt second only to rookie Odell Beckham Jr. And then, like, even if you want to play the 80+ PFF grade for day 3 wide receivers, you're looking at Amon-Ra St. Brown, Stephon Diggs, and Tyreek Hill. I mean, it's really everywhere you look with Puka Nacua, despite being a poor prospect, points to this guy's quite seriously a wide receiver 3 in Dynasty candidate.
Yeah, I had that conversation on the show a couple weeks back with David from the Bulletproof Discord, who, he does a lot of wide receiver data and stuff. And he was also kind of making the same case that, like, I don't know if he is the wide receiver 3 in Dynasty, but he should be in the conversation. You look at his target shares just in the game since Cooper Kupp's been back: 31%, 26%, 46%, 20%, 28%. He's not going away. He's not playing second fiddle to Cooper Kupp. He's a legit wide receiver in his own right. And I think anybody who's just like, oh, it's because of Matt Stafford, or, oh, it's because of Sean McVay, or this or that, I that's not really how I play the game. Like, I see a player doing this, and you look at what's been done throughout all of the league history, and it's more than likely that this dude just has it. And I agree with you. I don't think the price has really adjusted to where it should be. It's obviously a lot higher than it was to start the year, but if there's still room to climb, you can still buy in, and I think that's a good call. If we get Stafford back under center, I definitely think his value can rise. If we have to play Carson Wentz for multiple weeks, there might be a little delay in the value boost, but probably getting Stafford back after the bye. That's what the coaches seem to think. I will. Were you done with Puka? If you want to add anything else before I move on, that's totally cool.
Nope, you're good to move on.
All set. All right, my second guy here as a riser is Rashee Rice, who was another prospect that I just wasn't really interested in. I don't think that I got him in any of my rookie drafts, just in the range that he was going. In terms of his college production, just did not seem to be set up for success. And we just got fooled by a second round receiver to the Chiefs last year in Sky Moore, who I was all over because he actually did have that production in college. And I was like, fool me once, shame on me. But I wasn't going to be fooled twice. And I guess I was fooled because I passed on Rashee Rice, and he's actually been pretty solid. Like, not like Puka Nacua lighting the world on fire, but when you think about realistic expectations for rookie wide receivers, there is some stuff to like about what Rashee Rice is doing. He's been on a limited route share, but it has been rising. But his targets, like his yards per out run, targets per out run, has been pretty impressive. Kind of trending up. Kind of a down week last week, but just in general, he's been productive. And I think his role is going to continue to grow because the players around him are just so incompetent. Marquez Valdes-Scantling, Sky Moore, Kadarius Toney, these guys just cannot play. So I think if we can see Rice work his way into a full-time role by the end of the year, just the fact that he's on a Patrick Mahomes offense, he's going to really be a big breakout candidate for year 2. And I think you could see him move up into like that 5th round of startups kind of range.
Yeah, I'm not on the same wave as Rashee Rice, but I do agree that his per route peripherals look quite good. And we've seen his snap percentage start to go up. So hopefully in the second half of the season, we could see it. But the one thing just holding me back a little bit right now is that it is a limited sample because it's per route peripherals, and it's coming on an average depth of target that's quite low. So it's something where we want the snap percentage to, work its way up, which it has, and we want those per route peripherals to follow along. The other thing is we want to see it a little deeper downfield because right now it's what you call like more manufactured targets, less susceptible to fantasy points. So, but at his current value, he's not someone. I was saying, I try to flip my 1 Rashee or 2 Rashee Rice shares for Deontay Johnson. Unfortunately, the guy holding Deontay Johnson didn't quite go for it, but. I think he's fine, especially because he's not worth a whole lot right now.
Yeah, I like the call out there though. Like, it's not to say that he's on a star trajectory. There's definitely still cause for concern. There are flags in the profile, but we are seeing some signs of life with him. This isn't like you have to go and get this guy, he's going to break out. But I just think he's on a path where it's easy for me to see the narrative being spun in his favor as a breakout candidate for year 2. So I think both sides of it are fair. We want to exercise caution. You don't want to like buy the top with him, but I think there's still a chance to buy in on him now, even if you're not a big believer, where you're going to have a nice sell window to come later. So, and if he does, improve that ADOT and improve, as a full-time player, and maybe you just end up with a hit, that's cool too. But I think there's multiple ways that you can win on that investment. Let's kick it back over to you here. Do you have another riser candidate for us?
Yeah, my final riser, and I'm sure you'll get absolutely on board with it, is Kyler Murray. Now, the thing is, we've already seen the rise, because that's one thing that, why it was pretty much assuming, no setbacks or anything. Kyler Murray was a very safe investment in like the 3rd round of startups last year. And just honestly, his trade value, part of the reason why I have such a high share percentage. But the one thing is, all it takes is Kyler Murray to get near playing or get on the field finally for his value to rise. And we've already seen that. He was someone this offseason who wasn't touching quarterback 1 in dynasty range. Now we're seeing him quarterback 10, quarterback 11 on these sites. And this is also someone who was a good passer just a couple years ago. He had a down season last year, but just a couple years ago, he's one of PFF's highest rated passers. His peripherals look really good with it. And he's put up 20 points per game every single season that he's played, including his rookie season. So it's someone who's just always been productive, and he's signed quite long term. So yeah, the rushing production isn't going to look like would tend or would expect it to normally look for Kyler Murray. But like next year, for example, his rushing production should be back on the menu, and he's likely a pretty solid passer who's inked to a long-term deal. Kyler Murray is someone who, again, you don't even have to love him for you to see that the value is likely going to see another rise as he continues to play and get back into the groove.
And they're going to draft Marvin Harrison Jr., so that's also pretty cool.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, I definitely agree with you. He's my most rostered quarterback in Dynasty. I have him on almost half of my teams. And some of those are tanking teams, so we'll just ride it out for next year. Some of those teams, I'm cautiously optimistic I might be able to use him late in the season. We'll see. At this point, I'm just hoping for no injuries, just get out there and be healthy. But I do think that he was just basically free money. If you could buy him at his offseason price, where he was going in like the early to mid 3rd round of startups, it was just like a guarantee that eventually that was going to rise back up to the early 2nd to late 1st. And it made sense if you wanted to avoid him because you wanted to invest in players to score this year. You're trying to contend. I get that. But like, he was the perfect candidate for any tanking team to go out and get him, because the value gains were just guaranteed. Every injured player gains value as they come close to returning. And when that player is like an elite fantasy quarterback, where that's like the scarcest asset in Dynasty, that was just a real recipe for success. And so we're about to see that come to fruition. Hopefully it's all systems go and everything goes smoothly for him. But I definitely love that call. If he comes back and has a couple big games down the stretch, I mean, he's going to be right there in that like early 2nd round conversation, probably right around the like Anthony Richardson zone in startups. And that's going to be a big profit for people who invested in him, namely me, hopefully me. Yeah. So I love that. This has been great. I've really enjoyed hearing a little bit about your process and how you just look through these players through a really logical lens, and you really break down the range of outcomes. That's something I try to do in my process as well. So definitely respect the attention to detail there and all the data collection. Appreciate you coming on the show today. I'm just going to give you a quick go through all this stuff again. So follow Ian on Twitter at Dynasty. Is it underscore or no?
Yes,
no
underscore.
Oh, it is Dynasty _ IM. Got to make sure I get that right. And check out his work over at the 33rd team, where he's a lead Dynasty analyst. Check out my work at dynastyfootballfactory.com. Like the video if you're watching on YouTube. Follow the show on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, wherever you're listening. If you can do something to support the show, I'd really appreciate that. Ian, any final thoughts for the people before we get out of here, and anything you want to promote that you've got going on?
No, this is awesome. Thanks for having me on the show. I mean, I love just talking shop. I think one of the coolest things that I've had with this show is I think we got off topic from your show sheet a good 4 or 5 times, and it was great.
Yeah, I love seeing where the conversation goes. I always kind of expect to go off on some rabbit trail, especially when I'm talking to somebody that knows their stuff. I like to just kind of pick your brain, and so sometimes things just come up that I want to explore. So that was some of our best stuff too. So yeah, this has been a great show. Check out Ian's work. Check out Dynasty Football Factory. And we will see you guys next week on the factory tour.